February 1944. Rabaul, Solomon Islands. Marine Corps mechanics watched their F4U Corsairs return from another grueling mission against Japanese Zeros, the bent-wing fighters barely holding their speed advantage. The official Navy specifications said the Corsair's propeller pitch was optimized. The manual was clear: don't touch it. But one mechanic stared at those prop blades and saw something the engineers back in Connecticut had missed. What he was about to discover would add 25 miles per hour to every Corsair in the Pacific. And the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics never authorized it. The F4U Corsair was already legendary. The first American fighter to break 400 miles per hour, powered by the massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt Whitney R-2800. But in the brutal reality of Pacific combat, pilots knew their Corsairs were leaving performance on the table. The propeller blade angle, set according to factory specifications, was optimized for a compromise between climb rate and level flight speed. One unnamed mechanic looked at combat mission profiles and realized we're fighting the wrong way. His solution was brilliant and dangerous. By adjusting the propeller pitch to a flatter angle at high speeds, he could squeeze every last bit of thrust from that massive engine. The Navy manual said it would destroy the power plant. Combat results proved otherwise.
They had been told to expect hardship as prisoners. They had been told the Americans would be brutal, that captivity meant starvation and forced labor under inhuman conditions. German soldiers captured in France during the summer of 1944 arrived at prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States expecting the worst. What they found instead would shatter everything they thought they understood about the war they had been fighting. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, at Camp Forest in Tennessee, at dozens of facilities from Texas to Michigan, German prisoners of war witnessed something that seemed impossible. American soldiers left their vehicles running, not for minutes while they completed a task, but for hours. Jeeps sat with engines idling outside administrative buildings all day. Trucks remained running overnight. Generators hummed constantly, burning fuel to power lights, refrigeration units, and equipment that seemed, to German eyes, entirely unnecessary. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. One German officer, a company commander who had fought in North Africa and then in Normandy before his capture in August of 1944, watched American guards change shifts. The outgoing guard drove a jeep perhaps 200 yards from the guard tower to the motor pool. The incoming guard drove another jeep back. Both vehicles burned fuel for a journey that would have taken 3 minutes to walk. The German officer stood at the fence calculating in his head. 2 jeeps, perhaps a gallon of gasoline total, used to save 6 minutes of walking. In the Wehrmacht, that gallon would have been precious. It would have been accounted for, requisitioned in writing, justified as operationally necessary. Here the Americans burned it without thought, without paperwork, apparently without anyone even noticing. This was not an isolated incident. It was not evidence of poor discipline or unusual circumstances. This was normal. This was how the Americans operated every single day. The German prisoners talked among themselves in the barracks that night. They compared observations, the motors that ran constantly to heat water for showers, the trucks that delivered supplies when horse-drawn wagons would have sufficed, the training exercises they could see in the distance, where American units maneuvered with dozens of vehicles burning fuel for practice, for preparation, for scenarios that might never occur. The waste seemed incomprehensible. These were not naive men. They were combat veterans, many with years of military service. They understood logistics. They understood the relationship between fuel supplies and combat capability. They had spent years fighting a war where every liter of gasoline was calculated, conserved, fought over. They had seen operations canceled because fuel could not be spared. They had watched. Their own forces rely increasingly on horses for transport because motorized vehicles could not be fueled. They had heard, though perhaps not fully believed, that German tanks at the Battle of the Bulge had run out of fuel miles from their objectives, and now they stood in American prison camps, watching fuel being used for convenience, for comfort, for purposes that had nothing to do with combat necessity. The cognitive dissonance was severe. If Germany had been fighting a war where fuel shortages dictated strategy, where entire offensives were planned around fuel availability, where armored divisions ground to a halt for lack of gasoline, then what did it mean that America could waste fuel on trivial matters? What did it mean that their captors had so much petroleum that they simply let engines run because starting them again was mildly inconvenient? The answer, though few wanted to articulate it yet, was beginning to form. Germany had never had a chance. The war had been decided not by courage, not by tactical brilliance, not by the quality of German engineering or the skill of German soldiers. It had been decided by something much more fundamental: resources. And Germany had been fighting an opponent whose resources were so vast they seemed infinite. Germany's fuel problem had not begun with the war. It had been the central constraint of German military planning since the 1920s. Germany produced almost no natural petroleum. Its territory contained virtually no oil fields. Before the war, Germany imported roughly 85% of its petroleum needs from foreign sources, primarily from the Americas and the Middle East. This was recognized as an unacceptable strategic vulnerability. German chemists had developed a solution, or what appeared to be a solution. The Fischer-Tropsch process, perfected in the 1920s by Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch, allowed the synthesis of liquid fuels from coal. Germany had coal. The Ruhr industrial region held vast reserves. The process was expensive, requiring high temperatures and pressures, consuming enormous amounts of coal to produce relatively small amounts of gasoline. But it was possible. Germany could theoretically become fuel independent through synthetic production. The Nazi government, recognizing that war would cut off foreign oil supplies, invested heavily in synthetic fuel production. By 1939, Germany had built a network of hydrogenation plants and Fischer-Tropsch facilities. The largest was the Leuna plant near Merseburg, a massive industrial complex that could produce roughly 350,000 tons of synthetic fuel annually. Other plants at Pölitz, Berlin, Wesseling, and Scholven added to the capacity. Together, these facilities were meant to provide the fuel for mechanized warfare. On paper, the numbers looked adequate. German planners calculated that synthetic production, combined with imports from Romania's Ploiești oil fields and captured Soviet facilities, would provide sufficient fuel for military operations. They were wrong. The calculations failed to account for the voracious fuel consumption of modern mechanized warfare, or for the Allied strategic bombing campaign that would systematically target synthetic fuel production. The reality of German fuel supply became apparent almost immediately when war began. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 consumed fuel at rates that exceeded pre-war estimates. The blitzkrieg tactics that brought such spectacular success were also spectacularly fuel-intensive. Panzer divisions racing across Poland used gasoline faster than the logistics system could deliver it. The problem was temporarily masked by the short duration of the campaign and the capture of Polish fuel stocks. But the fundamental issue remained. The invasion of France in May 1940 followed the same pattern. German armored units achieved stunning breakthroughs, racing to the English Channel and cutting off Allied armies. But the fuel consumption was enormous. Panzer divisions that had started the offensive with full tanks found themselves rationing fuel within days. The famous halt order at Dunkirk, which allowed over 300,000 British and French troops to escape, was issued partly because German armored units needed time to refuel and refit. Success had come so quickly that the supply lines could not keep pace. Wehrmacht quartermasters calculated fuel consumption in units called Verbrauchssatz, or consumption units. 1 VSATS represented the amount of fuel needed to move a division 100 kilometers. The calculations showed that maintaining offensive operations required a steady flow of VSATS, that German production and logistics could barely sustain even in victory. In longer campaigns, the mathematics became impossible. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 made the fuel crisis acute. Operation Barbarossa involved roughly 3 million German soldiers advancing on a front that stretched nearly 2,000 kilometers. The distances were unprecedented. German units advanced hundreds of kilometers from their railheads, the points where supplies could be delivered by train. From the railheads, everything moved by truck, and trucks consumed fuel. The Wehrmacht needed fuel to move combat units forward and fuel to transport the fuel those combat units would consume. The logistics were circular and ultimately unsustainable. By December 1941, German units approaching Moscow were running out of fuel. Panzer divisions that should have been exploiting breakthroughs instead sat stationary, waiting for fuel trucks that could not reach them through winter snow and partisan attacks. The offensive ground to a halt, not primarily because of Soviet resistance, though that was fierce, but because German logistics could not deliver the necessary supplies across such vast distances. German military planners understood their fuel constraints, but they made a critical assumption that would prove catastrophic. They assumed their enemies faced similar limitations. Germany's intelligence services knew Britain produced little domestic oil and depended on imports, primarily from the Middle East and the United States. They knew the Soviet Union, while possessing oil fields in the Caucasus and around Baku, had limited refining capacity and transportation infrastructure. They knew France had virtually no domestic petroleum production. The assumption seemed reasonable. All industrialized nations in Europe faced fuel constraints. Victory would go to whoever managed those constraints most efficiently. This assumption shaped German strategy at every level. The invasion of the Soviet Union was planned partly to seize the Baku oil fields. If Germany could capture those fields and their annual production of approximately 24 million tons of crude oil, the fuel problem would be solved. The Wehrmacht would have the resources for sustained mechanized warfare. The campaign was designed around this objective. Army Group South's mission included advancing into the Caucasus specifically to secure those oil resources. The campaign failed to achieve this objective. German forces reached the Caucasus in 1942, getting within miles of the Grozny oil fields, but they never captured Baku. Soviet resistance and German overextension prevented the breakthrough. The oil that was supposed to fuel continued German operations remained in Soviet hands. Meanwhile, the campaign itself consumed fuel at unsustainable rates. By late 1942, fuel shortages were limiting operations on every front. The German synthetic fuel program, the supposed solution to oil dependence, was failing to meet demand. The plants required enormous inputs. Producing 1 ton of synthetic fuel consumed approximately 4 to 5 tons of coal. The process required water, electricity, and chemical catalysts. The facilities were enormous, vulnerable, and expensive to operate. Even running at maximum capacity, they produced only a fraction of what the Wehrmacht needed. Romanian oil became increasingly critical. The Ploiești fields produced approximately 5 million tons of crude oil annually, roughly 60% of Germany's total oil supply by 1943. Ploiești became the most strategically vital location in the German sphere. When American bombers struck the refineries in Operation Tidal Wave on August 1, 1943, German planners understood the implications. Without Romanian oil, the war machine would grind to a halt. But Germany continued fighting, continued launching offensives. continued operating under the assumption that careful management of limited resources could lead to victory. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was planned with detailed fuel calculations. Every Panzer division was allocated specific fuel quantities. The offensive was delayed partly to accumulate sufficient fuel reserves. When the attack began on July the 5th, German armor advanced, knowing that fuel shortages might force a halt before objectives were achieved. They were correct. After 2 weeks of brutal fighting, with fuel trucks unable to keep pace with combat consumption, the offensive was called off. German soldiers fighting these campaigns understood fuel was limited. They saw horses pulling supply wagons even in mechanized divisions. They watched tanks being abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they had run out of fuel and could not be recovered. They received lectures on fuel economy, on the importance of not wasting precious resources. The message was constant. Fuel is scarce. Use it carefully. Victory depends on efficient resource management. What German soldiers did not know, what German intelligence services failed to grasp until far too late, was that their assumption about enemy fuel constraints was completely wrong. Britain was receiving oil from America. The Soviet Union was receiving fuel through Lend-Lease. And America itself was producing petroleum at scales that made German synthetic fuel production look like a chemistry experiment. The numbers, had German planners seen them, would have been incomprehensible. Germany was fighting a fuel war it had already lost before the first shot was fired. The German prisoners arriving at American camps in late 1944 came from units that had been fighting under severe fuel constraints for years. A panzer division that should have had 500 vehicles in constant operation might have only 200 actually mobile on any given day. The rest sat idle, preserved for critical operations, waiting for fuel allocations that never seemed adequate. A Luftwaffe pilot might fly 3 or 4 combat missions per month because training flights were forbidden, flight time restricted to operational necessity only. Every leader was tracked, justified, conserved. At Camp Hearn in Texas, German prisoners worked in lumber operations and agricultural labor. American guards drove them to work sites each morning in trucks. The trucks arrived with engines already running, having been started 30 minutes earlier to warm up on cool mornings. In winter, the trucks might idle for an hour before departure. To the Germans, this was madness. A Wehrmacht driver who left his vehicle running unnecessarily could face disciplinary action. Fuel was too precious to burn while stationary, but the Americans had reasons the Germans could not initially comprehend. The trucks ran on gasoline so plentiful that the cost of fuel was less than the cost of potential engine wear from repeated cold starts. The motors were maintained on generous schedules because replacement parts were abundant. The entire calculation was different. American logistics prioritized convenience and reliability over conservation because conservation was unnecessary. Camp Concordia in Kansas held approximately 3,000 German prisoners by the end of 1944. The camp had its own motor pool with dozens of vehicles. Prisoners working maintenance details observed American mechanics performing routine service that seemed excessive by German standards. Oil changes every 1,000 miles, air filter replacements monthly, fuel filters checked and replaced regularly. One German mechanic, a former Luftwaffe ground crew technician, asked an American sergeant why such frequent maintenance was necessary. The sergeant replied that it was easier to prevent problems than to repair them. The German understood the logic but could not reconcile it with his experience. In the Luftwaffe, maintenance schedules had been extended repeatedly as supplies dwindled. Filters were cleaned and reused rather than replaced. Oil was used until it turned black and thick. Everything was conserved because everything was scarce. The prisoners began to understand that they were witnessing something beyond normal military operations. This was not a frontline supply depot where resources might temporarily concentrate. This was the interior of the United States, thousands of miles from any combat zone, at facilities that rated low priority for military resources. If this was how the Americans operated at low priority installations, what must their frontline units possess? Some prisoners had access to American newspapers and magazines. The publications were censored to remove sensitive military information, but they still contained details that shocked German readers. Advertisements for civilian automobiles, though production had been converted to military vehicles. Stories about gasoline rationing for civilians, complaining about limits of 3 gallons per week for non-essential driving. 3 gallons per week for civilians for personal convenience, while German panzer divisions were receiving fuel allocations measured in hundreds of liters for entire companies of tanks. One German officer, a battalion commander captured near Aachen in October 1944, read in an American magazine about civilian complaints regarding fuel rationing. He performed calculations in the margins. If American civilians were suffering under restrictions that still allowed them 3 gallons weekly for non-essential purposes, and if the American population was approximately 130 million people, then even a small fraction of civilian consumption represented more fuel than the entire Wehrmacht received monthly. The mathematics were overwhelming. The prisoners began asking questions. Where did all this fuel come from? The Americans must have captured substantial oil fields in North Africa or the Middle East. Perhaps they had secret reserves stockpiled before the war. Perhaps their synthetic fuel production far exceeded German capabilities. The answers, when they began to emerge, were more disturbing than any explanation the sheer prisoners had imagined. America was producing petroleum from the ground at rates Germany could not match even in theory. The numbers existed in American publications, in industry journals that circulated even during wartime, in Department of Interior reports that were matters of public record. German intelligence had access to some of this information before the war, but the numbers had seemed so extreme that analysts assumed they were exaggerated. Propaganda meant to intimidate potential enemies. The numbers were accurate. In 1944, the United States produced approximately 1,677,000,000 barrels of crude oil. This was not synthetic fuel requiring vast industrial plants and enormous coal inputs. This was petroleum extracted directly from underground reservoirs, refined in massive facilities, and distributed through an infrastructure built over decades of industrial development. Texas alone produced over 800 million barrels annually, more than half the national total. The East Texas field, discovered in 1930, was the largest petroleum deposit ever found up to that time. At its peak, it produced more than 1 million barrels daily. The Permian Basin in West Texas and New Mexico held reserves that seemed inexhaustible. California's fields added hundreds of millions of barrels more. Oklahoma, Louisiana, Kansas, and other states contributed additional production. The petroleum flowed from thousands of wells, moved through tens of thousands of miles of pipelines, processed in refineries with capacity measured in billions of gallons annually. Germany's total fuel production in 1944, combining all synthetic plants and Romanian imports, reached approximately 10.5 million metric tons. Converting to comparable units, this represented roughly 76.6 million barrels. The mathematics were stark. The United States produced approximately 22 times more petroleum than Germany could access from all sources. This was not a marginal difference in industrial capacity. This was a different order of magnitude entirely. Even these numbers understated the disparity because they did not account for allocation differences. Germany had to fuel its entire military from this limited supply. The Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, and the Luftwaffe competed for every leader. Civilian economy received minimal allocations. Transportation, agriculture, and industry operated under severe restrictions. The synthetic fuel plants themselves consumed vast amounts of coal and electricity, reducing what was available for other uses. Every drop was essential, every barrel accounted for, and allocated according to highest priority. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. America, by contrast, allocated petroleum with abundance that seemed impossible to German minds. The United States military consumed enormous quantities, certainly. The Navy fueled thousands of ships, from battleships burning thousands of gallons per hour to landing craft and patrol boats. The Army Air Forces operated tens of thousands of aircraft, bombers that consumed hundreds of gallons per mission, fighters and transports that flew constantly. The Army mechanized divisions used fuel lavishly compared to German standards. Yet after all military allocations, sufficient petroleum remained for civilian use, for agriculture, for industry, for purposes that had nothing to do with the war effort. American petroleum production exceeded all German fuel sources by a ratio that made strategic planning irrelevant. Germany could not conserve its way to parity. No amount of efficiency, no tactical brilliance, no operational genius could overcome this fundamental material disparity. The fuel crisis that had constrained German strategy since 1941 was not a temporary difficulty to be overcome through better logistics or captured oil fields. It was an insurmountable structural disadvantage built into the fundamental resources of the opposing sides. German prisoners, learning these numbers through various sources, through conversations with American guards, through newspapers and magazines, through simple observation of American abundance, began to understand. They had been fighting a war that was unwinnable from the start. The courage of German soldiers, the skill of German commanders, the quality of German equipment, none of it mattered when the enemy could field forces whose fuel supply was effectively unlimited while German forces counted every liter. The moment of realization came differently for different men, but it came for all of them eventually. For some it was gradual, a slow accumulation of evidence that could no longer be denied. For others it was sudden, a specific incident that crystallized everything they had been observing into undeniable truth. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, a German lieutenant colonel who had commanded a Panzer Grenadier regiment watched American soldiers conducting training exercises. The unit was practicing mechanized assault tactics using half-tracks, trucks, and jeeps. The exercise lasted 3 hours. At the end, the vehicles returned to their motor pool. The lieutenant colonel, observing from a distance, had been mentally calculating fuel consumption. 30 vehicles, 3 hours of operation, moving cross-country at varying speeds. By his estimates, the exercise had consumed roughly 1,000 liters of gasoline. A training exercise, teaching tactics that these soldiers might never use in combat, burning fuel that would have kept his regiment mobile for 2 days of combat operations. He stood at the fence for a long time after the exercise ended, watching mechanics service the vehicles, watching fuel trucks move between them, topping off tanks for the next training session. No one was concerned about the consumption. No one filed reports justifying the expenditure. No one calculated whether the training value justified the resources expended. The fuel was simply there, available, used as needed without constraint. That evening in the barracks, the lieutenant colonel spoke with other prisoners. He described what he had witnessed. One prisoner, a former tank company commander from the 21st Panzer Division, responded with his own observation. American guards had told him that every Sherman tank in American service carried a small auxiliary generator called a putt-putt that ran constantly to keep batteries charged and provide power for radios and equipment. A small generator, perhaps producing 1 kilowatt of power, burning fuel continuously. Every tank had one. The Americans manufactured tens of thousands of Sherman tanks. Each one carried this device that consumed fuel simply to provide convenience for the crew. The German tanker had commanded Panzer IVs in North Africa and then in France. His tanks had generators that ran only when the main engine was operating. Starting the main engine required effort, coordination, and consumed fuel. His crews learned to perform maintenance, to check equipment, to prepare for operations, all without starting the engine unless absolutely necessary. The Americans designed their tanks, assuming fuel would always be available to run auxiliary equipment constantly. The design philosophy itself assumed unlimited resources. Another prisoner, a Luftwaffe pilot, who had flown Focke-Wulf 190s over the Western Front, described his shock at learning about American pilot training. He had heard from guards that American pilots received 300 to 400 hours of flight training before combat deployment. 300 hours meant burning thousands of gallons of aviation fuel per pilot, fuel used for training, for practice, for preparation. He had received approximately 150 hours of training before his first combat mission, and that had been early in the war when fuel was less scarce. By 1944, German pilots were entering combat with as little as 30 to 40 hours of flight time because fuel for training could not be spared. The psychological impact was profound. These men had believed they were fighting for a nation that, while perhaps outmatched in raw numbers, possessed superior organization and efficiency. They had been told that German industrial production was of higher quality, that German forces achieved more with less, that fighting spirit and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages. Every article of faith was crumbling as they confronted the reality of American abundance. One prisoner, a former company commander who had served on the Eastern Front for 2 years before transfer to France, wrote in a letter that was intercepted and read by American censors, "We were soldiers fighting with rifles against an enemy armed with artillery. We simply did not understand the scale of what we faced." The German prisoners remained in American camps until the war ended and for months afterward. During that time, their education in American industrial capacity continued. They watched as the war in Europe concluded in May 1945, with German forces collapsing not from lack of courage, but from lack of everything: fuel, ammunition, food, replacement equipment. They heard reports of German tank units abandoned on roadsides, out of fuel, crews walking back to German lines. They learned of the final Soviet offensive, where German forces had perhaps 10% of the fuel allocation they needed for mobile defense. Some prisoners were assigned to work programs, agricultural labor that helped address American worker shortages. They harvested crops using American tractors that consumed fuel freely. They rode in trucks to work sites where American civilians operated automobiles for personal transportation. The contrast with Germany, where civilian fuel had been virtually eliminated by 1943, where horses had returned to cities because motorized transport could not be maintained, was overwhelming. Letters from home, when they arrived, confirmed what the prisoners had begun to understand. Germany was physically destroyed. Cities were rubble. The synthetic fuel plants, those massive industrial complexes that were supposed to solve Germany's oil dependence, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The Leuna plant was struck repeatedly from May 1944 onward. By March 1945, it was producing almost nothing. Pulitz, Berlin, every major facility was targeted and eliminated. German fuel production by April 1945 had dropped to less than 5% of its already inadequate 1944 levels. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, captured by Soviet forces in August 1944, were lost permanently. Germany's last significant source of natural petroleum was gone. The Wehrmacht in its final months operated on stockpiles that dwindled daily. Luftwaffe aircraft sat grounded on airfields. Tanks were dug in as stationary defensive positions because they could not be moved. U-boats remained in port. The entire German war machine simply stopped functioning, not because it was destroyed in combat, but because it had no fuel to operate. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, a German major who had served as a logistics officer on the Eastern Front spoke with an American lieutenant who was a petroleum engineer in civilian life. The American explained to him how oil wells were drilled, how natural petroleum was extracted, how refineries operated. The German officer listened, asked questions, performed calculations. He concluded that even if Germany had captured all the Soviet oil fields around Baku, even if production had continued at maximum rates, even if transportation infrastructure had functioned perfectly, Germany still could not have matched American petroleum production. The deficit was too large. The industrial base was too small. The resources simply did not exist in accessible locations. This realization destroyed the foundational narrative these men had believed. Germany had not lost because of tactical errors or strategic misjudgments, though those certainly occurred. Germany had not lost because of inadequate fighting spirit or insufficient sacrifice, though the human cost had been catastrophic. Germany had lost because it had challenged an opponent whose resource base was so vast that the outcome was never in doubt. Every battle, every campaign, every offensive, all of it was ultimately meaningless against the fundamental mathematics of industrial production. The psychological cost of this understanding varied among the prisoners. Some accepted it with grim resignation, seeing it as confirmation that their sacrifices had been in vain, ordered by leaders who either did not understand or did not care about material realities. Others clung to alternative explanations, to narratives about betrayal or incompetence that allowed them to believe the war could have been won under different circumstances. But most, confronted daily with American abundance, could not avoid the conclusion. They had been defeated before the war began by an industrial capacity they had never understood and could never match. The fuel disparity between Germany and the United States was not merely a logistical problem. It was the determining factor in nearly every strategic decision and military outcome from 1941 onward. When German military planners designed operations, fuel availability was the primary constraint. The invasion of the Soviet Union was planned explicitly to seize oil resources. The North African campaign aimed partly to secure Middle Eastern oil or at least deny it to Britain. The desperate defense of Romania in 1944 was motivated entirely by the need to protect Ploiești. Every major strategic decision Germany made was shaped by fuel scarcity. The United States planned operations with fuel abundance assumed as the baseline. American amphibious assaults in the Pacific involved thousands of ships burning fuel continuously. The logistics vessels alone, the tankers and supply ships that supported combat operations, consumed more fuel than entire German army groups. During the Normandy invasion in June 1944, American forces landed with the infrastructure to deliver fuel at rates that would have supplied the entire Wehrmacht. The Pluto pipeline, designed to pump fuel under the English Channel, could deliver 1 million gallons daily at peak operation. That single pipeline's capacity exceeded the total daily fuel production of all German synthetic plants combined. American strategic bombing of Germany focused increasingly on oil production and distribution from May 1944 onward. The campaign was devastatingly effective because German fuel infrastructure was centralized, vulnerable, and could not be quickly repaired or replaced. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that attacks on oil production were the single most effective strategic bombing effort. By January 1945, German fuel production had collapsed to approximately 20,000 tons monthly, roughly 6% of what was needed for minimal military operations. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 illustrated the strategic impossibility of German victory. German planners designed the offensive around capturing American fuel dumps. The operation began with fuel allocations sufficient for perhaps 100 to 150 kilometers of advance under optimal conditions. The plan explicitly required German units to capture American fuel supplies to continue the offensive. This was not supplementary to the plan. It was essential. German success depended on seizing enemy resources because German logistics could not sustain the operation independently. The offensive failed for many reasons, but fuel shortage was critical. German armored spearheads that should have been exploiting breakthroughs instead sat stationary, out of fuel, waiting for supply columns that never arrived. The 5th Panzer Army's lead elements reached within miles of the Meuse River, but could advance no further because they had no fuel. American forces defending key road junctions, particularly at Bastogne, prevented German access to fuel dumps. Without captured American gasoline, the offensive collapsed. German units abandoned hundreds of tanks and vehicles, not because they were destroyed, but because they had consumed their fuel allocations and no more was available. American forces counterattacked with abundant fuel supplies. When weather cleared and allowed air operations, American aircraft flew thousands of sorties. Each sortie consumed hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel. The fuel was available, delivered through logistics networks that functioned with such efficiency that frontline units never experienced shortages. The contrast was absolute. Germany launched its last major offensive of the war, knowing it had insufficient fuel to sustain operations, gambling that captured supplies would compensate. America defended and counterattacked with fuel resources so abundant that conservation was never considered. Post-war interrogations of German commanders revealed that most understood the fuel situation was hopeless by late 1943. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, told interrogators that planning any major operation after the summer of 1944 was an exercise in fantasy because fuel allocations bore no relationship to operational requirements. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, stated that German panzer forces by 1945 were effectively immobile, waiting for fuel that would never arrive in sufficient quantities. The German prisoners who witnessed American fuel abundance in 1944 and 45 carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Many returned to Germany in 1946 and 47, repatriated to a nation that was physically destroyed and psychologically shattered. They brought with them an understanding that the war had been unwinnable, that the sacrifices demanded of German soldiers and civilians had been in pursuit of an impossible goal. This knowledge was bitter. It meant that comrades had died for nothing, that cities had been destroyed needlessly, that the entire catastrophe had been foreseeable for anyone willing to examine material realities. Some former prisoners wrote memoirs or gave interviews decades later. Their accounts consistently returned to the shock of American abundance, to the moment they understood what Germany had been fighting against. One former officer, interviewed in the 1970s, described watching American vehicles idle for hours and suddenly comprehending that Germany had lost the war not in any battle, but in the fundamental mismatch of industrial resources. Another prisoner, who had been a tank commander, stated that seeing American fuel usage made him understand why his Panzer Division had spent more time stationary than mobile, why operations were constantly delayed for fuel allocations, why the promises of victory had always been illusions. The fuel disparity was not the only factor in Germany's defeat. German strategic errors were numerous and catastrophic. The decision to invade the Soviet Union while still at war with Britain, the declaration of war on the United States, the Holocaust's diversion of resources and moral bankruptcy, all contributed to the outcome. But underlying every strategic decision, constraining every military operation, determining what was possible and what was fantasy, was the reality of resources. Germany could not produce enough fuel to sustain mechanized warfare against opponents who possessed or could access effectively unlimited petroleum. The prisoners who returned home rarely spoke about their realization in detail. German society in the immediate post-war years was focused on survival, on rebuilding, on processing the guilt and trauma of defeat and the crimes committed in Germany's name. Questions about fuel logistics seemed trivial compared to moral reckonings with genocide and aggressive war, but the knowledge remained. Germany had challenged the world's greatest industrial power and been crushed, not despite German courage and skill, but because those qualities were irrelevant against overwhelming material disparity. For the Americans who guarded these prisoners, who observed their reactions to abundance that seemed normal, the lesson was different. They learned, though perhaps not consciously, that industrial capacity was a form of military power as decisive as any weapon. The factories in Detroit and Texas, the oil wells scattered across the American Southwest and California, the refineries processing crude oil into gasoline and diesel, these were war-winning assets as important as any army or fleet. American victory was built on the foundation of resources that the enemy could not match and apparently had not fully understood. The German prisoners who watched jeeps idle for hours, who saw fuel used casually for convenience and comfort, who witnessed American abundance and recognized German defeat in that abundance, understood a truth that military historians would analyze for decades. Modern industrial warfare is won by production capacity. Courage matters. Training matters. Leadership and tactics and strategy all matter. But they matter within constraints set by available resources. When one side possesses overwhelming material superiority, when the disparity reaches ratios of 20-1 or greater, the outcome is predetermined. The only question is how long the war continues and how many die before the inevitable conclusion. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.